right, so welcome back, everybody. We've been wanting to look into this for a while now, and I'm kind of creeped out, not going to lie.
Yo, yeah.
But today's deep dive is all about historical stampedes.
Ooh.
And you've been wanting to know more about what causes them, right? Like how often do these things happen?
Right.
And is there any way to actually stop them?
Yeah.
So to get into all of this, we've pulled some stuff from Wikipedia, we've got some news articles,
Okay.
and we've even got this really interesting Medium piece.
Interesting.
I gotta say, going through these sources, one
Yeah.
thing that just jumps out at me is how many of these tragedies have actually happened?
Yeah.
And in like all kinds of different places, right? Not just what you might expect.
It really is surprising, like even with all we know now about crowds and how they behave and all the safety measures that, that are in place now.
Right.
Stampedes still happen.
They do. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So before we get into specific events, let's just define what a stampede actually is.
Okay.
We all have this image in our minds.
Right.
But how would you actually explain it?
So, a stampede is basically just a sudden, uncontrolled movement of a large crowd.
Okay.
And what makes it so terrifying is the sheer force that's involved, right? When you have that many people surging all in the same direction, the pressure can become immense. Just imagine, being caught in that. People literally getting crushed, unable to breathe, can't even move their arms.
That's scary. That
Yeah.
primal fear of being trapped, just completely helpless.
Right.
It's easy to see how panic would set in so quickly in that situation.
Exactly, and it's that panic that often, really makes things even worse.
Yeah.
And it can be triggered by any number of things.
Like what?
It could be fear, excitement, sometimes even just a rumor that spreads through a crowd can be enough.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And you mentioned, Stampede's still happening today.
Yeah.
Even with, our modern understanding. One event that I think really brought this issue to light, though, was the Hillsborough disaster.
Right.
Could you give us some context on that? What happened?
Of course. So the Hillsborough disaster happened on April 15th, 1989.
Okay.
At Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, England.
Okay.
And it happened during an FA Cup semi-final match between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest.
Oh, wow.
Tragically, 97 people lost their lives.
Wow.
And another 766 were injured.
Those numbers are just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think is really interesting reading through all this stuff is that this tragedy really seemed to change the way stadiums were designed.
Yeah.
Not just in England, but globally.
It absolutely did. So after the disaster, there was this inquiry led by Lord Justice Taylor.
Oh.
It became known as the Taylor Report.
Got it.
And they found that a major contributing factor to this whole thing was the infrastructure at Hillsborough Stadium.
Okay.
Specifically, there weren't enough turnstiles for all the fans. So they were forced into these really tight, confined spaces.
Oh, so they were funneled in.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, it was bad.
So inadequate infrastructure then really played a key role in this tragedy.
Yeah.
And Hillsborough, it's not the only example, is it? There are other cases where, the design of the stadium or just a lack of crowd control
Oh, yeah.
were factors.
Absolutely, yeah.
What are some other ones?
Well, there's the 2001 Ellis Park Stadium disaster.
Where was that?
That was in South Africa. And there, fans were pushing through a locked gate.
Oh, gosh.
Which created just this awful crush.
Oh, my God.
And it really shows that even when you have some precautions in place,
Right.
things can still go very wrong if the infrastructure just isn't there to handle a huge crowd.
So even with better infrastructure, though, are we still at the mercy of how the crowd behaves? You know what I mean?
Well, human behavior definitely plays a huge role in stampedes, that's for sure.
Right.
Take, for example, the Iroquois Theater fire in Chicago. Yeah. It wasn't a stampede in the usual sense.
Right.
But it really shows how quickly a crowded space can turn deadly when people panic.
And the sources describe the Iroquois Theater as supposedly fireproof.
Right, yeah.
And yet on December 30th, 1903, it became a death trap.
It's tragic. The theater was just packed that night, way overcrowded.
Oh,
even the aisles were full.
Oh, gosh.
And then a fire broke out and panic just took over.
Yeah.
And the exits were blocked.
With people.
Yeah, people just desperately trying to escape.
It's just a reminder that a sense of order can just completely disappear in a crisis, right?
Yeah.
And then the crowd itself becomes the danger.
Right.
It's just, I imagine that feeling of being trapped
Yeah,
would just make people even more desperate to get out.
absolutely. Yeah, that desperation's a key factor.
Right.
And sometimes it's not even a real threat.
Oh, wow.
It's just a rumor. That's all it takes.
Really?
Yeah, the Kodinka tragedy, which happened during Tsar Nicholas II's coronation in Russia,
Oh, yeah.
it's a really stark example of this.
So what happened there?
So it happened on Kodinka Field, where people were gathering to get commemorative gifts,
Oh.
including food.
Okay.
But a rumor started spreading,
Oh.
saying that they were running out.
No!
Yeah, and so, of course, everyone started panicking,
Yeah.
rushing towards these distribution points.
Didn't want to miss out.
Exactly. Over 1,000 people died in that chaos.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it was awful.
Just amazing. Like, misinformation
Yeah,
can be just as dangerous as an actual threat.
it really can.
And it's not just a historical thing, is it?
No,
I mean, these things still happen.
they do.
As 10 of the worst stampedes in the world in the past,
Mhm.
the Times of India shows
Yeah,
this issue is not going away.
not at all.
The Mina stampede during the Hajj in 2015,
Yeah.
where over 2,000 pilgrims died, is just a really stark reminder of that.
Right.
And it shows that these stampedes can happen anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Anytime.
At any time, any place.
It's not limited to a certain kind of event or anything.
Right.
I mean, we see these tragedies at religious gatherings, concerts, festivals, sporting events,
All over.
all over the world.
Mm.
So this begs the question, are all stampedes preventable? It seems like there's always going to be some level of risk
It does, yeah.
when you have that many people together.
It's a tough question for sure. While some things are impossible to predict,
Right.
sudden panics or, if some unexpected event happens,
Yes.
a lot of these tragedies are preventable.
Okay.
If there's careful planning,
Right.
good infrastructure,
Okay.
and effective crowd management.
You mentioned the Taylor report earlier,
Oh, yeah,
leading to all these improvements in stadium design in the UK.
right.
What were some of the key changes they made?
So one of the big ones was moving towards all-seater stadiums
Okay.
in, like, the top tiers of English football.
So no more standing room only.
Right, yeah, because getting rid of those big standing-only area, especially the ones right in front of the goal,
Yeah.
that helped to reduce the overcrowding.
Especially like when a goal is scored or something exciting happens.
Exactly, yeah.
And I would think having individual seats helps people maintain like a sense of personal space, right?
It does.
Which might help prevent that feeling of being trapped
Exactly, it does.
that we talked about.
Yeah.
So it's less anonymous
Yeah,
and a more controlled environment.
exactly.
So what else did they change?
So the Taylor report also said there needed to be better crowd control measures, like
Okay.
having designated entry and exit points,
Okay.
wider concourses.
Wider walkways.
Right, and clearer emergency protocol.
So they weren't just thinking about the stadium itself,
Yeah,
but also how the crowds would move through it.
exactly.
It was a
yeah.
multifaceted approach.
Yeah, exactly.
And these changes have been, like, adopted all over.
They have, yeah.
Not just in football, but in all kinds of big events.
Yeah, you see them everywhere.
But still, stampedes happen.
They do.
It makes you think we still have more to learn.
Right, and that's where the research comes in.
Okay.
Our sources mention ongoing research into crowd dynamics
Okay.
and using technology to try and, like, predict and manage crowd behavior.
Okay. That's something I wanted to get into.
Yeah.
But before we do, I think we have to talk about the role of authorities,
Okay.
both in preventing these tragedies
Right.
and then in how they respond afterwards.
Yeah.
One incident that really stands out to me is the Luzhniki disaster in Moscow
Oh,
back in 1982.
right.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the Luzhniki disaster is a tragic example of how a lack of transparency from the authorities can actually make a situation worse.
Okay.
It happened during a UEFA Cup match,
Okay.
and there was a fatal crush in one of the stairwells.
So similar to Hillsborough in that it was in a stadium,
Hmm.
but like a different set of circumstances.
Exactly.
So what happened?
So the Soviet authorities, they really downplayed the whole incident.
Really?
Yeah, and that led to just a ton of confusion
Yeah.
and conflicting accounts of what actually happened.
So a lack of clear information from the authorities just made things more chaotic.
It really did.
And that seems like it would breed even more distrust
Yeah.
and potentially even more panic.
It could, yeah.
And to make matters worse, Western media, they didn't really have all the facts.
Right.
So they ended up like really exaggerating the death toll.
They did, yeah.
So it's not only the authorities contributing to misinformation,
Yeah,
but then that misinformation getting amplified even more.
exactly.
And so it becomes even harder to figure out what actually happened.
Right.
It's a perfect example of how a lack of transparency and accurate information can make a tragedy even worse.
It is.
And it's not an isolated incident.
Well, no.
It makes me think back to the Kudenka tragedy,
Yeah.
where just a rumor was enough to set off this deadly stampede.
Right.
It seems like misinformation, whether it's intentional or not,
Right.
can be incredibly dangerous
It is.
in these situations. But it also highlights how important it is to have these independent investigations, right?
It does, yeah.
And to have reliable sources of information.
Right.
So people can actually understand what happened and, hopefully learn from it.
Exactly.
That brings us back to Hillsborough.
Yeah.
And all the scrutiny that was on the South Yorkshire police
Yeah.
and how they handled things.
Yeah.
The Hillsborough Independent Panels Report,
Right.
which was released in 2012
Yeah.
after years of campaigning by the victims' families,
Right.
revealed some pretty damning evidence.
It did.
And I think it's important to remember that this report came out way after the initial investigations.
It did, yeah.
So what did they find?
Well, the report found that the police had some major failings.
Like what?
Inadequate crowd control.
Okay.
A really delayed response to, what was happening. And probably the worst part is that they tried to shift the blame onto the fans.
What?
Yeah, they were saying that the fans were drunk.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, disorderly hooligans who
Oh,
were actually responsible for the whole disaster.
so not only were there operational failures,
Yeah,
but then a cover-up on top of it
pretty much.
just to protect themselves?
Yeah,
Wow.
and it took decades
Oh, God.
of work by these families to
Yeah.
finally get to the truth.
It's incredible,
Yeah,
but also, deeply disturbing.
it is.
It shows how important transparency is
Yeah.
and accountability,
Right.
especially when you have people in positions of authority failing to protect the public.
I agree, and it also highlights how important it is to challenge those official narratives.
Yeah.
Even when it seems like, they're not going to listen.
Right.
The families of the Hillsborough victims, they refused to be silenced.
Good for them.
And it was their perseverance that led to, the whole event being looked at again.
It's a reminder that even when you're up against huge power
Yeah.
and institutions that don't want to change,
Right.
the truth can still come out
It can.
if people keep fighting for it.
Exactly.
And I think that's a great place to pause for.
Okay.
We've got a lot of ground in this first part,
We have.
looking at the complexity of stampedes, everything from the infrastructure and crowd behavior
Right.
to the crucial role of the authorities
Yeah.
and how important transparency and accountability are.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
But it sets us up well for the next discussion.
Exactly. When we come back, we'll dive even deeper into the psychology of crowds
Okay.
and explore what makes people act the way they do in these really intense situations.
Looking forward to it.
We'll also look at some of the emerging technologies
Yeah.
that could help us better predict and manage these crowds in the future.
I'm excited to get into those details. There's some really interesting stuff there.
So stay with us, because next time, we're going inside the mind of a crowd.
Sounds good.
So welcome back, everybody. Last time, we talked about the physical things that can lead to stampedes, the infrastructure and stuff. But to really get this, don't we kind of have to get inside the mind of a crowd?
Yeah, I think so.
Because, in our everyday lives, we think of ourselves as individuals, right? Making our own choices.
Right.
But something happens when you're part of a huge crowd.
Yeah, it's like a shift,
Yeah.
Your own sense of responsibility kind of disappears.
You get swept up in it.
You do. It's like you're less self-aware and more influenced by what everyone else is doing.
So it's not just about people making bad decisions.
Right.
It's something more fundamental about how we behave in those situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Psychologists call this de-individuation,
Okay.
and it's a really powerful thing.
De-individuation.
Yeah, so basically, when you're in a big crowd, you lose your sense of, personal identity.
You become anonymous.
You do, and you become less inhibited, too.
Oh.
And you start doing stuff that the group is doing, even if it goes against what you would normally do.
So, you're more likely to just go along with the crowd,
Yeah,
even if it's something, you wouldn't normally do on your own.
exactly. And that's where the danger is. Remember the Iroquois Theater fire? The panic that happened there, it wasn't just a bunch of people making bad choices individually.
Right.
It was like a collective response.
Like a mob mentality.
Yeah, exactly. Driven by fear and de-individuation.
So they weren't bad people.
No.
They were just caught up in it.
Yeah, they were just reacting to what everyone else was doing.
And that feeling of panic, it's contagious, right?
It is. If one person starts freaking out, everyone around them feels it.
It just spreads.
It does, yeah.
Like a wildfire.
And that's because our brains are wired to, like, look out for danger.
Yeah.
And if you see hundreds, thousands of other people freaking out,
Yeah.
you think, oh, there must be something really wrong.
Yeah, I better freak out too.
Exactly.
The fight or flight kicks in.
It does. And on a huge scale, too.
Yeah. I mean, especially in a situation like a stampede where there's that perceived threat.
Right.
That fight or flight must be incredibly powerful.
It is. And at that point, you're not really thinking rationally.
Right. You're just reacting.
Yeah, you're not thinking about consequences.
Just get me out of here.
Exactly. It's all about survival.
So how do you design for that? I mean, if you know people are going to act irrationally,
Yeah.
can you make environments that, like, make those stampedes less likely?
Well, that's where good design comes in. Think about the Taylor Report
Okay.
and all the changes they made to stadiums. You know, clear signs,
Yeah.
specific entry and exit points,
Yeah.
wider walkways so people aren't all crammed together.
So it's not just about the physical space,
Right.
but also, like, how people move through it.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where people stay calm.
Right.
And don't panic.
So, like, almost nudging people toward more rational behavior,
Yeah.
even when their instincts are telling them to run.
Exactly.
It's kind of like designing a building to withstand an earthquake, right?
It is, yeah. You can't stop the earthquake from happening.
Right.
But you can minimize the damage.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So speaking of anticipating those kinds of problems, let's talk about technology.
Okay.
Some of the sources mention using things like sensors and AI
Right.
to monitor crowds in real time.
Yeah.
Is that something that's actually being used now?
It is. Researchers are using that stuff to, like, track how dense the crowd is, how people are moving,
Okay.
and even, like, their emotional state.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, so it's like a really advanced early warning system.
So they can tell if a crowd is getting agitated
Yeah.
or if certain areas are getting too crowded?
They can, and with that info, they can start adjusting things.
Like what?
Like redirecting people to different areas.
Okay.
Or sending security to where the problems might be.
Before it even starts.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So it's not just reacting after a stampede starts. It's trying to prevent it altogether.
Yeah, that's the goal.
But, I mean, there are some ethical considerations here, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we have to balance safety with people's privacy.
We don't want to turn into some kind of surveillance state to
Exactly.
prevent stampedes.
No, we have to have those conversations about ethics alongside the technology.
Right, because any new technology
Yeah,
can be misused.
it can.
So it's not just about the tech itself.
Right.
It's how we use it
Exactly.
and what safeguards we put in place.
Yeah, that idea of balance keeps coming up.
It does, doesn't it? We talked about it with infrastructure and crowd behavior.
Uh-huh.
Now it's safety and privacy.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
So after all this,
Hmm.
what do you think? Are all stampedes preventable?
You know, it's hard to say for sure. People are unpredictable.
Yeah.
There are always going to be things we can't foresee.
Right.
But I do think we can prevent a lot of them
Okay.
if we have a multifaceted approach.
So, like, what does that mean?
Well, we need to combine everything we've been talking about.
Okay.
Good infrastructure,
Yeah.
effective crowd management, understanding how crowds work,
Okay.
and using technology responsibly.
It's not enough to just focus on one of those things.
Right, you have to look at the whole picture.
Create a system where all those elements work together
Exactly.
to reduce the risk as much as possible.
Yeah, and that system needs to be, like, constantly evolving.
As we learn more.
Yeah, we can never just assume we have it all figured out.
That makes sense. But let's shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about what happens after a stampede.
Okay.
We talked about the Luzniki disaster and how the authorities mishandled it.
Yeah.
The way these things are investigated and then communicated. It seems like that has a huge impact
It does.
on how the public perceives them
Yeah,
and even on future prevention efforts.
it does. What happens after a stampede is just as important as what happens before it.
Wow.
Transparency,
Okay.
accountability.
And a willingness to learn from those mistakes.
Right.
Those are essential.
And Hillsborough is a perfect example.
It is, yeah.
You know, the lack of transparency,
Right.
the lack of accountability
Yeah.
in those initial investigations.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did it just add to the suffering of the victims and their families,
Right.
but it also delayed any meaningful changes.
It did for decades.
Wow.
Yeah, it was awful.
And it took all that work by the families to
Yeah.
get to the truth about what happened
Exactly.
and to hold people accountable.
Yeah, it was a huge fight.
It's inspiring,
It is.
but it also makes you wonder how many other tragedies have happened
Yeah.
where we don't know the full story.
Yeah, where the truth has been hidden.
Right. Or the victims were blamed unfairly.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have those independent investigations.
Right.
And to be transparent.
Yeah.
We need to make sure the victims' voices are heard.
That their families are heard. Yeah, and that the truth comes out.
Because without that, we can't learn from these tragedies.
Right.
And prevent them from happening again.
Exactly. And those human stories are so important.
They are.
Because they remind us why this matters,
Yeah.
why we need to keep pushing for safer environments,
Yeah.
and why we can't just sit back and think, oh, this isn't a problem anymore.
It's empathy, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Putting yourself in the shoes of those who have been through it.
Yeah.
And understanding that these aren't just events on a page. These are real tragedies.
That affects real people.
Yeah. They have ripple effects that go way beyond just the people who are there.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm feeling, a lot of things.
Yeah.
Sadness, of course.
Of course.
For the lives lost.
Yeah.
For the suffering.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It is. But I also feel hope,
Yeah.
knowing that things can change.
They can.
That we can learn from this. And that these tragedies can lead to something better.
I feel that too. People can be so amazing,
They can.
So compassionate,
Yeah.
so resilient.
It's really something.
They do.
And it's up to all of us
Mm-hmm.
then to take those lessons and move forward.
Yeah.
To be mindful of how we act in crowds.
Right.
To advocate for safer environments.
Yes.
And to, remember the people who've been lost.
Yeah, to honor their memory.
When we started this deep dive, we asked if all stampedes are preventable.
Yeah.
And I think the answer is we can't eliminate all risk,
Right.
but we can reduce it significantly.
We can.
If we keep doing the research,
Yeah.
if we design smarter infrastructure,
Right.
if we have good crowd management strategies,
Yeah.
and if we use technology responsibly.
It's about using all the tools we have.
We've explored the history, the
Yeah.
science, and
Yeah.
the human cost
Yeah.
of these stampedes, but this isn't the end of the conversation.
It's not, no.
It's up to each of us to take what we've learned and actually do something with it
Exactly.
in our own lives,
Yeah.
in our communities.
And remember, even in a huge crowd,
Yeah.
you're not just a face in the mass.
You're an individual.
You are, and your choices matter.
Right.
Your actions have consequences, and you
Yeah.
can speak up. You can make a difference.
So next time you're at a concert or a festival
Yeah.
or a big game,
Think about what we've talked about.
be aware.
Be aware.
Have a plan.
Uh-huh.
And look out for the people around you.
Yeah, let's create a world where everyone can enjoy those events safely.
And not be afraid.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been great.
We'll see you next time. We spent a lot of time talking about, all the different factors that go into stampedes, like crowd dynamics, the infrastructure,
Yeah.
the technology. But I think what we really need to remember
Uh-huh.
is that these are human stories. These are real people.
Exactly.
The victims, the survivors, the families.
The first responder?
Yeah, everyone involved. Their experiences really bring home how devastating these events are.
They do, yeah. We can talk about all the statistics and models and all that stuff, but it's those stories
Yeah.
that really hit you in the gut, the lives that are lost, the families,
Yeah.
the trauma. That stuff lasts
Yeah.
long after the crowds are gone.
It's easy to get caught up in the technical stuff.
Yeah.
But we can't forget that these are real life tragedies.
No.
With huge consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And I think, the Hillsborough disaster, probably more than any other event,
Yeah.
really shows us how important those human stories are.
Yeah.
The families of those 97 victims,
Yeah.
they fought for decades
Wow.
to uncover the truth,
Yeah.
to challenge that narrative that blamed the fans, and to make sure that their loved ones weren't forgotten.
And their story's incredible, right? It's like a testament to
Perseverance.
perseverance and just seeking justice,
Yeah.
even when
Even when it seems impossible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they refused to accept those initial findings.
Yeah.
That said, the victims were just like drunken hooligans.
Right.
And they just kept pushing
Yeah.
for real investigation.
They did, and their efforts led to that Hillsborough Independent Panel's report,
Right.
which exposed all those failures,
Yeah.
and it led to new inquests
Yeah.
that finally
Gave them
the verdict of unlawful killing.
Yeah.
Which is what they deserved.
It's an amazing story.
It is.
But it makes you think, like, how many other times has this happened?
Right. How many other tragedies have been covered up?
Yeah. And the victims blamed.
Yeah.
That's a scary thought.
It is, and it shows why it's so important to
Yeah.
have those independent investigations.
And to be open and honest about what
To
happened.
be transparent, yeah.
Because without that, we can't learn.
We can't learn, we can't prevent the next one.
And that's why those human stories are so crucial.
They are.
They remind us why all this work matters.
Yeah.
Why we need to keep pushing for better, safer places.
And why we can't just assume it's all been taken care of.
Yeah, it's about empathy.
Right.
Yeah.
It is. It's about understanding what those families went through.
Putting yourself in their shoes.
Yeah, and realizing that these aren't just, like, abstract events. These are real tragedies.
That affect real people.
Yeah, they have a huge impact, not just on the people who are there,
Right.
but on everyone around them.
So we're wrapping up this deep dive now.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling, I don't know, a lot of things.
Me too.
Sadness, of course.
Of course, for everyone who's been affected.
But also hope.
Yeah, I hope that we can do better.
Yeah, that we can learn and grow and actually prevent these things from happening.
That's what it's all about.
And I think it's up to all of us
Yeah.
to take what we've learned
Uh-huh.
and actually make a difference.
To do something with it, yeah.
To be mindful.
Yeah.
To advocate for safer spaces.
Yeah, to keep those memories alive.
When we started this, we asked, are all stampedes preventable? And I think the answer is, well,
Not all of them, no.
but we can prevent a lot of them
We can if we work at it.
if we keep doing the research.
Right?
If we design better spaces,
Yeah.
if we manage crowds effectively,
Mm-hmm.
and if we use technology responsibly.
It's a team effort, for sure.
We've looked at the history,
Yeah.
the science,
The human cost.
yeah, and the human stories.
They're the most important part.
They are.
They remind us why we do this.
Yeah, and this conversation, it doesn't end here.
It doesn't know. It's up to all of us to keep it going.
To take this information out into the world
Yeah.
and do something with it.
Exactly.
And remember,
Yeah.
even when you're in a huge crowd,
Uh-huh.
you're not just a face in the mass.
You're an individual.
Your choices have an impact.
Yeah. And you can speak up.
You can make a difference.
Don't be afraid to.
So next time you're at a big event,
Yeah.
a concert, a game,
A festival.
just take a second.
Yeah.
Think about what we've talked about.
Be aware.
Have a plan.
Look out for each other.
Let's work together
Yeah.
to make sure everyone can enjoy those events safely.
That's the goal.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.